Hello and welcome to Mann's Model Moments. This video is the start of a series that I'm calling Mann's Model Method. I'm creating this for modelers joining the hobby for the first time, those returning after a long break, or even those who are just interested in seeing how I approach modelling and maybe pick up a few tidbits along the way. I'm going to be talking about how to get started in this hobby, what tools you'll need at which point, and how to build up your skills from the most basic through intermediate and hopefully into advanced. As such, it may well cover points you already know or have mastered, and it's not that I'm trying to patronise anyone, but I want to start without any assumptions so anyone can follow along, even if you've never done a model kit before. I'll also be showing how I make models, but please note that this is not the right way for everyone. It's just what I do and the way I have developed, and if it helps some others along the way, then that's great. If you find a way that works better for you, then that's just as valid. My own modelling journey is continuously evolving and changing as I learn new or better ways of doing things from other modelers too. Sometimes I try things other people have recommended to me, or I've seen on a video or something, and I find it doesn't work well for me, or my prior technique is better for what I'm doing, and that's also absolutely fine. There are, after all, no SOPs or required standards in modelling, it's all personal preference. With that covered, let's move on to today's video, which is number 1 in this series. I'm going to show you how to enter the hobby for about £30. This money has to cover everything we need to create our first model. There are no hidden extras or assumptions here, outside of normal everyday things that everyone should have access to, like water. And if you don't, you should be concentrating on more important things than modelling. With this £30 budget, I'm going to show you what to buy and then go through building a model with those purchased items, so you can do exactly the same thing if you want to and follow along with me in the video. So how are we going to spend our £30? Well, the first thing we need are a set of tools. You may already have some of these, but once again, I'm not going to assume anything, so we're going to buy a complete set. Now you can check out my video on modelling toolsets if you'd like to see what to avoid, but I'll give you the short version here as I sell a set through my shop which has everything you need, and although you will need to add to this as you progress, many of the items in it will serve you well for a long time. Now I sell this set for £12, and you may be able to find these cheaper elsewhere, or only need certain items. In the set, we get a set of nippers, a modelling knife and a set of blades, 2 pairs of tweezers, one straight and one angle tipped, a file, and 2 sanding sticks with various grades of abrasives. You also get a little cloth to wipe things down, but that's not really needed. The ones we'll be primarily relying on here are the modelling knife, nippers, and sanding sticks. So if you're buying things individually, those are the things to focus on. Tweezers are nice to have at this stage, but not essential, and you can leave out the file. Anyway, I'll assume that we're buying the full set, so this eats up £12 of our £30 budget, which is a fair chunk, and we haven't even decided what to build yet. For that, it really depends on your interest, so I'm going to give you a choice depending on where your interests lie. They all do have something in common, however. They're all Airfix starter sets. Now the reason I've chosen starter sets is that they come with paints, glue and a brush. The reason that they are Airfix is that the company have been investing since 2016 in creating starter sets that are really designed for starters. Historically, this was not always the case, and starter sets were just any old kit with some paint and glue thrown in, which is a terrible idea. Many manufacturers still do this, and Airfix should be lauded here as really setting the bar much higher than others in creating dedicated toolings for beginner modelers. Now of course there are some kits which you could use as alternatives here, and if you want to do that, then that's absolutely fine. I'm just giving you some pointers here, and I want to make sure that what I'm using in these videos is going to be readily available to pretty much anyone. These starter sets do have a few things in common. They have a relatively low part count model, with reduced complexity to make the building experience less frustrating for newcomers, which is a great idea when you are new to a hobby. The last thing you want is to be pulling your hair out in frustration because of a kit's complexity when you are just starting off. They all contain glue, which although is not the best, it's good enough to get us started. They also contain a fairly decent paintbrush or two, depending on the set, which isn't part of the tool set and is obviously essential for painting. They also contain paint, though this is by far the weakest element of the kits, and in most cases I would advise discarding it, or at least putting it aside for other uses in the future. Now let's look at the kits I advise you to buy depending on your interests. You have a good choice with World War II aircraft, since it's such a popular period and there are a multitude of subjects available. I'm going to say the 2024 BF-109F or P-51D are top of the pile here, with the Spitfire Mark V probably being the best British subject. These are all available for just £11, meaning we still have £7 out of our £30 to spend. Alternatively, Airfix sell paired boxings of these, the P-51 and 109, Spitfire and 109, or even the Spitfire and Hawk if you want to split across eras. These are all available for £18 and represent great value as an entry point. As I've featured the P-51 and the BF-109 on the channel already, I'm going to use the Spitfire Mark V. To start with, I'm going to say the Airfix F-35 is the ideal entry point here. Again, I sell this for £18, meaning it fits perfectly within that overall £30 budget. This is one example where I think the paints supplied with the kit are absolutely fine for use on the aircraft, as it's such a simple scheme. This was a 2023 tooling and it's incredibly well engineered for building, even if it takes some shortcuts with some areas. The other possibilities here are the Red Arrows Hawk, which like many of the sets you can pick up for £11. Again, as I've already built the F-35 a couple of times on the channel, I'll be using the Red Arrows Hawk here. This is an easy one, as the Sherman Firefly and Tiger 1 sets are perfect, though I think the Firefly is actually better for beginners. If you can't decide between them, there's also a classic conflict pack with both in for about £18. As I already mentioned, I actually think the Firefly is the better kit for beginners here, but as I've already done a speed build of it, I'm going to build the Tiger 1. Civilian vehicles actually gives you the widest choice of starter kits here, but it comes at an increased cost, around £14 each. If you like your classic cars, there's the E-Type Jaguar or Aston Martin DB5. For modern supercars, you have a Pagani, McLaren, Bugatti or Lamborghini to pick between. If you're looking for something a bit closer to a real-life affordable car, then the workhorse Land Rover is the one to choose. I like my supercars on the exotic side, so I'm going to be using the Pagani for my build. Here there is only one kit I'd recommend, the Mary Rose, but it's a little gem, despite it being a slightly earlier 2010s tooling. We do now have the Shannon class lifeboat, which seems great if you fancy something a bit more modern and substantial, but it's a bit too complex of a build for your first kit, so I'd save that for kit number 2 or 3. Don't however be tempted to extend your budget and get the HMS Belfast gift set. This is a much older tool and really not ideal for a beginner at all. Now if we have one of our cheaper Airfix starter sets, we will have around £7 still left in our budget, and I'm going to spend that on ICM paints. They have a large range of sets at around this price, but I'll be recommending individual paints for the starter kits above. Suffice to say that these are much better paints than those supplied with the kits and will last you much longer too. Check out my video on the full paint set if you're interested in why I think they're so good. Now if we got a car kit, I'm going to make a slightly different recommendation, and that is to buy a spray paint in whatever colour you want your car in. You'll get a much smoother finish, a single can will last much longer than your one model, and they're readily available at around the £4 mark. So let's summarise those choices for this series to build in the next video. I'm going to do identical videos on each subject's type: World War II aircraft, post-war aircraft, military vehicles, cars and naval, so you don't have to watch one with a subject that you're not interested in. Or if you want to come back and try a different subject, you have a dedicated video build for it. Now I just want to take a moment to thank all of you who have supported me directly through YouTube memberships and Patreon. This really does keep the channel going, and without you it would be very difficult for me to be able to continue doing this. Now if you're only just seeing your name on here for the first time, it's because I update this monthly, and if I've prepared some videos ahead of time, then there may still have the old list on, even if the list has been updated since then. Don't worry though, your name will get on the list and will continue to appear throughout your support. If you are considering supporting me, YouTube channel membership is by far the easiest way to do this, since Patreon is becoming a more challenging platform to engage with. Whichever you choose, however, I absolutely appreciate your contributions, and don't forget to come and check out the private members Discord, which you get access to at any level. Now for the rest of the video, I want to talk about basic skills before we get into the videos that actually demonstrate these in action. I'll take these roughly in the order that we'll use them too. The biggest item in our set are our trusty nippers. These are basic, but importantly they are reasonably sharp and have fairly narrow jaws with one flat edge. These allow us to get as close to the parts we want to snip off as possible. Now these are termed as double-bladed or double-edged nippers. That's because when we look up close they have two cutting surfaces, one on each side, and those come together to exert pressure on both sides of the part. Now although I just called them cutting surfaces, and they are relatively sharp, but they are not blades. As such, they actually dig into the plastic and then exert pressure on a very small area, which actually squeezes the plastic until it fractures. That has upsides and downsides. The upsides are that these nippers are both cheap to make and buy, and they're relatively strong, meaning you can use them on almost any plastic you can fit in their jaws. They're ideal for harder plastic, big gates, or cutting up sprue. The downsides are that firstly, they don't produce a smooth cut, but leave a burr on the part removed, the size of which can vary a lot depending on the size of the gate, where you cut it, the plastic hardness and so on. This burr then has to be removed by other means. Secondly, because you are using force to fracture the plastic, using them can actually break small, thin or fragile parts, so you need to take care when using them. Knowing this means that you can mitigate it in the way you use them, however, so bear this in mind when we come to use them. Now how to use these is pretty obvious, but there are some practical points that will make things easier to start with and will serve you well as you develop as a modeller. Now first, and this is obvious but it is surprising how often people will break this practice, is to hold your nippers firmly and comfortably in your dominant hand, and then move the sprue or frame containing the part to meet it. This gives you the best control over what you're doing, and it might not always be possible, but when I've done something silly with nippers, like damage a part or myself, it's because I was either angling my hand or holding my nippers in an odd position to try to reach a piece without shifting things about, usually to try to save time or some other such hasty action. Secondly, when I talk about moving the part to the nippers, I mean the part should be facing the flat-bladed side of the nippers. This is the side that will give the cleanest cut edge. Now the mistake that you're most likely to make when you start out is to place these flat blades right up close and touching the part, with the idea that this will leave the smallest, cleanest nub for cleanup. It's a good idea, but as I mentioned before, because double-sided nippers crush and stress fracture the plastic rather than cutting through it cleanly, this can actually damage the part, either tearing out pieces or even breaking more fragile ones. The safest route then is to back off the part by a small amount, say 0.5 mm or so. This leaves a slightly larger nub for removal, but significantly lowers the risk of part damage. Always try to remember it's easier to remove plastic than to add it back. The next tool we're likely to use is our model knife. Now, I'm not going to tell you how to use a knife. If you don't know, then you probably shouldn't be using one. But I will mention some things I've learned along my journey. My scalpel is my most used tool, since it has incredible breadth of application, from cutting open parts bags through trimming and scraping to manipulating fine parts and even decals. To me, it's almost an extension of my hands now, and yet I've also injured myself more with this one tool than any other. Part of that is how much it gets used, and another is that these are incredibly sharp blades, and you are much softer than plastic. The great majority of it, however, is user error. I'd say 99% of my self-inflicted injuries with my blades have been through incorrect use, usually the application of too much force. So however you use your knife, whatever type you choose or grip you prefer, just be careful. Respect and understand the fact that you are using a very sharp instrument to cut something that is harder than you are, so mishaps will likely end up in your injury. Some people will say you should always cut away from you. Personally, I never have, because I find I have much less control over the blade that way, and I'd rather have more control over it than less. I will brace my thumb against whatever I'm trimming if possible, to keep everything steady, and if I do slip, I'd rather cut my thumb than something with more organs inside it. I also use small, shaving movements because trimming smaller amounts of plastic is easier, safer, and it's also better for the model. Once again, it's much easier to remove plastic than put it back, so shaving rather than cutting is my general mantra. You may think after not telling you how to use a knife, I'm going to do the same about a brush, but you'd be wrong. I think brushes are probably one of the most incorrectly used tools in the scale building hobby, so it's best to start off in the right way, because developing good habits from the start will serve you well when you start to be able to buy more expensive tools that you don't want to mess up. Firstly, take care of your brushes. Store them vertically, tip up, ideally in a rack, but a glass or mug will do to start with. Clean them after use. We're going to be using aqueous acrylics to start with, so dish soap and water is ideal after a painting session. When using a brush, always wet it first. Your brush shouldn't be dry when you put it in paint. It shouldn't be dripping with water, just immerse it and wipe it off in your palm. This will help with the next point, which is one I know many scale modelers don't pay attention to. Don't put your brush all the way into the paint. Ideally, you should have paint on about half of your brush. If your brush is dry, paint will wick up into the ferrule, the metal bit retaining the bristles, and your brush lifetime will shorten. The next couple of points are also very basic but often overlooked. Make sure you have decent lighting so you can see what you're painting. This actually goes for your whole project, but it is especially important for painting. If you can, you want to have daylight temperature lights, especially if you're mixing or comparing colours, because incandescent lights or warm LEDs will change the perceived colours you're using. The other major point is to brace what you're painting somehow. We are not robots who can lock our limbs in a static position, and no matter how well you think you're maintaining staying still, in reality your body does this by constant tiny adjustments. Now, bracing can be as simple as putting your elbows on the desk and resting your painting hand on the hand holding the part. But what this does is form a nice stable platform for both the part and the brush, which helps enormously with brush control, a skill that you'll develop over time, but which is not aided by your hands moving about whilst you're doing it. The last thing I'll say on using a paintbrush is to make sure you use appropriately thinned paint. Most model paints are too thick to just slap on plastic. Now, I will talk more about paints and thinning etc. in future videos, but this is just something that should be in your mind whenever you come to painting a model. Mini painters are much more cognizant of all of these points, and as I've said many times before, watching mini painting videos and creators is always a good thing to pick up further advice on using that fabled hairy stick. As I said, I'll speak a lot more about brushes and painting in later videos, but for the moment I just want to establish some basics that will help us when we start to build. Sanding sticks, files, emery boards, sanding paper, whatever you use, I'm going to lump them all together under this general heading of abrasives. There's not really much to say about their use, just a general warning about the dust they create. Like any other sanding dust, try not to breathe it in. Polystyrene dust is pretty much inert, but that doesn't mean you want it in your lungs, mainly because what goes into your lungs tends to stay there, and they're pretty delicate structures. Your body can put it with some major abuse, but I don't think a hobby should necessarily add to that, so just be sensible and don't go snorting it. The other point to note here is that you want to use an appropriate tool and size grit for the task at hand. There's no point in using 1000 grit sandpaper to sand the nub off a freshly clipped part, but you also don't want to go straight in with 180 grit to smooth down a seam. As a rule of thumb, start with a grit size lower than you think you will need, try it, and if it's not enough, step up. Once again, it's easier to do this and progressively work to something that will take off more plastic than start with something too aggressive and have to deal with the damage it does. Right, with that we should be armed with everything we need to get cracking. I'll look forward to seeing you in the following videos where I actually start to build the Airfix kits. If you're interested in doing this along with me, I'll link all of the kits and products I'm going to use in the video description below. Also, please do let me know in the comments if you found this video useful or if you think there's anything else you'd like me to add in future. That's all for this instalment of Mann's Model Moments. If you enjoyed the video, please click the like button, subscribe to the channel for more like it, and share this video with others you think would also enjoy it. You can also follow me on Instagram, Twitter and Facebook, and if you're feeling generous then I also have a Patreon, which is absolutely the best way of helping me to grow the channel and produce more content like this. With that, I hope you have plenty of modelling moments of your own, and I look forward to welcoming you on the next video.